mic on. Yes, hello. For anybody that might be tuning into this, I'm going to try to repeat this a couple times. This is a new thing for you to be seeing streaming. This is for anyone, of course, but it might be for meant a little bit more for Sunday school teachers. In other words, on Sunday night or Wednesday nights for a couple of years now, I've been trying to take the adult teachers, anybody that wants to come, and certainly children's teachers or whoever, but I normally have a small and faithful group that will come alongside me, and we'll just preemptively go over the lesson material for Sunday, not for me to teach it to them, but to just explore some topics, some deeper things, food for thought. So I'm starting the Isaiah intensive tonight, and with that, I wanted to take the time to try to still continue to do this, but that's going to dominate my normal time for the teachers. So this is going to be about a 30-minute block to try to get as much covered as we can. So if you're hearing this, this is not in lieu of what's going on Wednesday night. Bart is going to come on right after me and teach. So just stay in store for that. Anyway, so for those who are here in attendance, I don't know what's wrong with the mic. I don't know why it's not connecting. So it is what it is. But I'm loud enough. I'm hopeful that it will work, at least for you guys. And if they don't capture it, we'll just have to try to correct that next week. Anyway, so 2 Kings 3, because this week we're going to be covering a little bit more on Elisha. We're going to be going into depth on his person and character and ministry in the context of 2 Kings 4 and 5, and with that, exploring some of the miracle stories that surround his time as prophet. But I do want to back up to 2 Kings 3, because as we explored this material a little bit, well, we didn't get to last week, I guess, because we had the town hall. But for those that heard me either through the recorded lesson or were part of my Sunday school class, and maybe you heard it in your Sunday school class, the way that we should be reading and understanding the material as we've progressed through 2 Kings so far is that Elijah's story parallels some New Testament figures, sure. He's got a lot in common with John the Baptist, even Jesus. That's apparent. But a lot of his ministry is also based off the life of Moses and a couple of the things that Moses did that were of particular prominent importance. And a lot of what we see Elijah doing when he enters in on the scene, challenging Ahab, is very reminiscent of the story of Moses going to challenge Pharaoh in his palace in Egypt. And then right after he challenges Ahab, it's off to the land on the other side of the Jordan, close to where he's from. With that, it's like mimicking the exodus of Israel out of Egypt, and then the supernatural provisions he gets from the ravens bringing him bread and water. And even after the showdown on Mount Carmel, when he leaves the land again, escaping Jezebel's wrath, to go down to Mount Sinai, that in and of itself kind of picks up that Exodus narrative. So with all that in mind, if we're reading Elijah's picture and story as something of a retelling of the Moses story arc, then naturally when we get to the end of Moses' storyline, when he is like Elijah was on the eastern side of the Jordan River, and he's about to leave Elisha, his chosen successor, not by him, handpicked by the Lord, then we should naturally be lending ourselves to thinking that in the story of Elijah, if Elijah is about to leave, as Moses was about to bow out and die, the handpicked success, or I should say the chosen successor that was supposed to stand up and replace him was Joshua, then we're looking to Elisha as being something of a new Joshua figure. That's kind of how we're supposed to see that as the story is progressing onward. And so we're going to be thinking through some of those things, those elements tonight, along with some other stuff. But anyway, 2 Kings chapter 3, and I want to start in verse 9, and I'm going to be picking everyone's mind in here as to what it is that you're seeing alongside me and how this story is reflecting off of previous stories and what is that informing us of. So in 2 Kings 3 verse 9, so the king of Israel, the king of Judah, and the king of Edom set out. Just to give you a little bit of background here. So what's going on is Ahab actually is dead now, and his son Jehoram ruling in his place. And Moab, upon Ahab's death, has decided to rebel. And in rebelling, they want a full-on military conflagration with Israel. And so Jehoram's son is trying to enlist Jehoshaphat if we remember the story. Jehoshaphat has already aligned himself through marriage with Ahab, and Ahab called upon him one time to go and battle Aram, Israel's most prominent enemy. And so that almost ended badly for Jehoshaphat, but that's the circumstance by which Ahab died. Jehoshaphat didn't learn his lesson there, and instead he chooses to align himself with Jehoram, Ahab's son, to go to battle against Moab. And now they wound up picking up another king by virtue of what we just read. And we're not entirely sure why Edom is getting involved in this, if for no other reason than they share a northern border with Moab, and perhaps in some way it's either a family thing because Edom is distantly related to Israel, or Edom's kingdom is threatened as well. Not entirely sure, but that's what brings this triumvirate of kings together to go against Moab. Okay, so after that, they traveled their indirect route for 7 days, and they had no water for the army or the animals with them. I think I need to back up. Yeah, let me back up to verse 8 for a second. Because when they're there, trying to figure out how to get to where they need to go, the question is asked at the beginning of verse 8, which route should we take? And the reply is the route of the wilderness of Edom. So to give you a quick geography lesson, if you can situate your bearings on a map of biblical lands, then that is them traveling down the western side of the Dead Sea and then turning to the east and then going north on that tip of the Dead Sea, which would be the northern side of the kingdom of Moab, to get into what becomes the plains of Moab, which is where this skirmish is going to wind up happening. So if you're thinking that, if you're tracing that route, hold on. I actually have a whiteboard app here. Let me try to find it. I forgot about that. It's been so long since I've had a chance to use that. So here's the Dead Sea. They're going southward, turning in this direction, wilderness of Edom, and then they're wrapping themselves up to get up here to Moab. Down here is Arabia, and here is Egypt. Hold on a second. My thing doesn't write that far on the bottom of the screen. There we go. So Egypt's not that high. It's way down there. But anyway, if you think about the trajectory of this direction and the way they're traveling, does that kind of ring a bell, as goes any prior migratory movements that Israel has went through in the past, where they're marching rank and file as an amassed army ready for conflict? What story does that bring to mind for us? Right, so Moses leading the camp of people. Of course, this is at the end of the almost 40 years worth of wilderness wandering, and they're making the final trip up to the eastern edge of the Jordan before they eventually begin their assault into the land to start the conquest period. So that kind of reminds us of that story. We don't have enough information yet to say we're firmly grounded there. Back to verse 10. They've been on this journey now for 7 days. They have no water for the army or the animals. So obviously this is a dire crisis. Verse 10, the king of Israel said, "Oh no, the Lord has summoned these 3 kings only to hand them over to Moab." So lack of water for man and beast has caused a situation where not only is there a crisis, but we have somebody who is verbalizing that. And is he doing this in a positive way, saying, hey, there's no water, but God's going to provide? We've learned from our lesson in the past where we've had these kind of issues in this very same geographic region, and God provided then. So let's just wait. God's going to provide. Instead, what do we have the king doing? Yeah, he's grumbling. He's assigning themselves to death already, as if to say there's nothing God can do. Now, when you consider that, we just mentioned a second ago, we've got some details in the story based off where they're traveling, how they're traveling. This kind of puts us a little bit closer to the story where Moses is leading them on the final part of the campaign to get to the plains of Moab. And it's right around that part in the book of Numbers where Moses actually rebels himself. And it's all because the people are grumbling, needing water. So here we have the king of Israel, kind of their spokesman, grumbling because there's no water. So it seems like we've got a second detail. Would you agree? That puts us back in that part of the narrative where Israel wandering through the wilderness. And with that, that puts us in the bigger context of the Exodus story. All right, moving forward a little bit more. So Jehoshaphat says in verse 11, "Isn't there a prophet here? Let's inquire of the Lord through him." So one of the servants of the king answered, "Elisha, of all people, who used to pour water on Elijah's hands, is here." It's an interesting fact that he decided to travel along with him. That's not something Elijah would have done or that we have record of. Anyway, Jehoshaphat affirmed, "Yes, indeed, the word of the Lord is with him." So they go and they summon him. He comes before all the kings. And he kind of takes a moment to berate Jehoram or Joram, Ahab's son, but he honors Jehoshaphat, saying, it's because of him, basically, that I'm going to respond. And down in verse 14, we get what he says. By the life of the Lord of armies, before whom I stand, if I didn't have respect for Jehoshaphat, I wouldn't even look at you, talking to Joram. I would not even take notice of you. Now bring me a musician. A weird little detail, and I don't have time to chase that down. But anyway, as the musician is playing, the Lord's hand comes on Elisha, and this is what he says: "Dig ditch after ditch in this wadi." So they are apparently pretty close to a dry riverbed, and he's telling them to dedicate resources and men who are pretty close to, perhaps potentially thirsting to death out in this hot, arid climate, with the scarcity of water that they have, and they certainly can't draw from the Dead Sea, but nonetheless, they are supposed to dig ditch after ditch. And he says, "For the Lord says, though you will not see wind or rain, the wadi will be filled with water, and you will drink, you and your cattle and your animals." So God's spokesman steps up and says that God will supernaturally provide water because there will be the absence of anything that would be a natural means of water showing up in this area. Does that potentially put us back in this Exodus arc where they're traveling in the wilderness, need water, and have no means of getting it themselves? Yes. And who is God's spokesman in that particular part of the story? Moses. And so Elisha is taking up the Moses mantle here with that. Even though we just mentioned a second ago, his story arc is supposed to be a little bit more reminiscent of Joshua's, yet there are some overlaps with respect to that. Anyway, verse 18, "This is easy in the Lord's sight. He will also hand Moab over to you." And we heard Moses say the same thing, right? How many times did he say, "The Lord will go before you. He will hand either the Amalekites or certainly the Amorites on the eastern edge of the Jordan over to you?" So in a way, it's also kind of mimicking that, because that's where the battle campaign started originally. "And then you will attack every fortified city and every choice city. You will cut down every good tree, stop up every spring. You will ruin every good piece of land with stones." Now, if we're remotely familiar with what Moses has given them direction-wise in Torah, when he was speaking about what they should do and not do when they go out to battle against other people, we'll find that some of these things are clearly outlined as things they should not be doing. With respect to just cutting down every tree. If it's a dead tree or a tree that doesn't produce fruit, that's fair game. But if it's a tree that does produce fruit, they're not supposed to be decimating the land when they go and lay siege to other cities that come provoke Israel to war. So that's battles outside the land of Israel, and certainly in the land of Moab, that's where they are. So nonetheless, Elisha here is kind of spelling out not a statement that lends itself to condoning this activity, but saying that this is what they'll do. And perhaps that might inform us as to how this story ends. But moving on. Verse 20, "About the time for the grain offering the next morning, water suddenly came from the direction of Edom and filled the land." Now notice this. All Moab had heard that the kings had come up to fight against them. So all who could bear arms, from the youngest to the oldest, were summoned. They took their stand at the border. And when they got up early in the morning, so they're facing kind of south by southwest, the sun was shining on the water, and the Moabites saw that the water across from them was like red blood. "This is blood," they exclaimed. Where have we heard that before? Egypt. So, that's the very first plague that comes down on them is all the fresh water in Egypt, starting from the Nile, gets turned into blood. It's not like blood. And, of course, this is just something of an apparition of sorts in the sense that certainly it's not blood. It's just the way the sun is shining on the water. But it's another detail that the person who is crafting the account for us wants us to pay attention to, because in the broader context of the entire Exodus story from start to finish, leaving Egypt until they finally cross the Jordan and enter the land, we've got all these select details that are lining up in this story to bring that story back to mind. And we also keep in mind here that the king of Israel, the son of Ahab, he's not as wicked as his father, but it is said of him in summary that he's just as bad as Jeroboam, and he continued to lead Israel in the apostasy that Jeroboam started. So, and as Elisha condemns him, if it wasn't for the fact Jehoshaphat was here with you, I wouldn't even look at you, wouldn't give you the time of day. So all that to simply say that in spite of present company, God is still choosing to work something miraculous here in his gracious manner. Anyway, picking up on verse 23, the kings have crossed swords, their men have killed one another, so to the spoil, Moab, God throws them into confusion as he has many other enemy camps that come to battle against Israel. However, when the Moabites came to Israel's camp, the Israelites attacked them. They fled from them, so Israel went into the land attacking the Moabites. And they did everything Elisha said, destroy cities. Each of them would throw a stone to cover every good piece of land. They would stop up every spring, cut down every good tree. And this went on until only the buildings of Kir Hareseth were left. And then the men with slings surrounded the city and attacked it. So for days, potentially, they have been campaigning against the land of Moab and have conquered many cities and destroyed many key features of the land to subjugate Moab almost completely. And then we have this weird little thing where the king, in an effort to try to stop the advance, sacrifices his firstborn son, the crown heir apparent, or I should say heir apparent to the crown, as a burnt offering on the city wall. And then this chapter ends with great wrath was on the Israelites, and they withdrew from him and returned to their land. So what does this mean? What we should be thinking here as teachers is the idea that we have very clearly spelled out for us a rehashing of the Exodus story. Again, the story arc that goes from Egypt all the way up to the land of Canaan. In spite of the fact that we have certain people that are characters that are rather nefarious, and God normally wouldn't be doing things like this for them, except for the fact that he's choosing to be gracious. We have many key details in the actual Exodus story itself that spell out the same thing. Egregious moments of apostasy or grumbling, and God does bring judgment, but nonetheless, he's faithful, he preserves. But at the end of all this, even though it's shaping up like an Exodus story, the writer of Kings, as he has in so many other stories before this, turns the whole thing upside down on its head, because you feel like they're pretty confident that Israel is going to rue the day here. They're going to completely decimate Moab in the end, but they don't. Instead, they press the advantage all the way up to what could be their capital city, because this is where the king is holed up at, and he chooses to sacrifice his son. But then God doesn't bring wrath upon Moab and decimate them. God brings wrath upon the Israelites. Why does that happen? We're not told. Part of it could be the way Israel was acting. Elisha had predicted would indeed occur, that they stop up the wells, cut down all the good trees, throw stones on all the good land. They're decimating Moab, but they're not supposed to be doing that. They're exceeding the mandate here to just simply go and do battle with the king who has rebelled. And they hold true to what Elisha predicted, and perhaps that could be part of the reason. Another thing here is it's almost like a perversion of the Passover. Remember, the Passover itself is built on the story of Abraham sacrificing Isaac in Genesis 22, but that story doesn't actually end that way. He's not allowed to kill his son, and his son is spared. Instead, we've got this pagan moment where kings around this area of the world were widely known for sacrificing children to the gods Chemosh, Milcom, or Molech and whatnot. So I would say that the king perhaps had done something like this in the past with other kids that were not his firstborn, or at least other people in the land were familiar with this sort of thing. And this is what God finds to be one of the most reprehensible things that the Canaanites and other people around them were engaging in. But again, why does he bring wrath on the Israelites? We're not entirely sure. So as teachers, it's incumbent upon us to explore these things and ask those questions of our students. Why is the story shaped up like this? What is the author of Kings attempting to try to hint toward? And then how does this inform us of Elisha's ministry moving forward? So with that, any particular questions? So that question has been asked often, and commentators, take pen to paper and attempt to try to answer that. Usually the best answer that we could get from such a thing is to go straight back to the actual original Hebrew text, as best we have it preserved for us, and understand what is meant, but we don't seem to really get much of a straight answer either way with respect to that. Most commentators seem to lean more toward the idea that it's not the Moabites here that somehow have stalled the progress and now are able to come out of the city and bring wrath upon the Israelites by decimating many of the soldiers, and then they realize, hey, we've lost momentum and we've just got to go back. We've done enough devastation and it's going to take them time to rebuild or whatever, so let's just cut our losses and move back. It seems like this wrath is indeed coming from the Lord, but we don't know in what way. It's not spelled out to us as it would be in the accounts in the wilderness when God brings judgment in the form of fiery serpents or plague or whatever the case might be. So without those details, it still kind of leaves it open to speculation, right? We're just not really sure. Anyway, moving on to 2 Kings 4 for the next 5 to 10 minutes. So there's a couple things here I'd like to try to point out. Number one, starting with verse 1, one of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elisha, "Your servant, my husband, has died. You know that your servant feared the Lord. Now the creditor is coming to take my 2 children as slaves." Anybody in here familiar enough with this story? Can you tell me how this story will play out? It's just these next 6 verses after this. So Elisha asks, what can you do, basically? And she says, I've got some olive oil at home. That's really about the only thing that I have of value. And so he tells her to borrow as many empty containers as she can get. Just keep pouring from the one jar that's got olive oil until they're all filled. And of course, the miracle is that the oil continues to be multiplied until all containers are filled, and then the oil stops being poured, which would make us kind of just scratch our head and, okay, that's awesome. God displayed his power. And then we move on to the next story, which in some ways is really disjointed from this one. But let's pay attention to what the first verse in and of itself is cluing us in on. Number one, from the outset of Elisha's ministry, when he crosses back over the Jordan River, he meets this company known as the Sons of Prophets that were stationed at Jericho. There was another one up at Bethel, and they are going to accompany him throughout the remainder of his ministry. He's practically with them everywhere he winds up going. So this is one of those particular members, and the wife that he was married to, he's died. She's on the hook now for apparently some debt. Creditors are wanting to come. She can't pay, has nothing of value. They want to enslave their children. Now, what provisions has been put in place to prevent these kinds of things from happening? Just think of a few key features. What happens on a regular cyclical basis to prevent people from being perpetually sold into slavery and there being no means of them being delivered from that? Anybody got an idea? So you've got the year of Jubilee, that's every 50 years, but a smaller scale version of that, and one of these actually happens the year before Jubilee because it's the 49th year, which puts us on a series of what? 7 or sabbatical years. So on the sabbatical years, what's supposed to happen? All debts aren't necessarily canceled. They're more or less postponed for a year, but nobody is supposed to be held in contempt over defaulted debts. Eventually, they will be permanently relinquished, but slaves are supposed to be set free. And not only that, to invert that, slaves aren't just simply told to go home when they have nothing to show for the however many years or months they've been in slavery or servitude. They are supposed to be released like kings, right? Laden down from the pantries and storehouses of the person that owned them as their master. So all of that to say that those laws are meant to prevent this kind of thing from happening, even though a person can sell themselves into slavery or whatever the case might be. But the way that Israel was running at this time, the northern kingdom, they are in every way, shape, and form in abeyance against the law of Torah. They're not operating by the wisdom standards in there, and so we would have every reason to think these creditors are going to maliciously and perpetually oppress and enslave this woman's children, which makes her all the more vulnerable if she doesn't have sons there to also continue to provide and bless her. So in the background, we've got something here with respect to the sabbatical years, the years of Jubilee, or also the concept of kinsman redeemers, right? Kinsman redeemers from the book of Leviticus chapter 25 with respect to redeeming land that gets sold off to pay for debts. That land is supposed to eventually come back, but it can come back sooner than waiting for the year of Jubilee if a kinsman redeemer can buy it back. Or, in the case of Deuteronomy 25, In certain circumstances, it might mean stepping up and actually marrying a person, a woman whose husband has died, which is probably your brother or close relative, right? So some of those things should be humming in the background for us. Let's move on down and go to the next section in this story, starting in verse 8. So from verse 8 through verse 10, we've got this woman who lives in this little area known as Shunem. Elisha apparently makes several trips around that way, and she notices that he is what is called a man of God. And by virtue of that, she wants to offer something to him, and that is build him a little space for him to rest himself on his journeys. So she talks to her husband, and they both agree. Now, one particular issue here is that her husband's very old, and apparently, even though men are virile all the way up to practically the late stages of their life, she has remained childless up to this point, and that creates an opportunity of blessing for Elisha as Elisha receives this gift from her. But here's some things I think we should notice here. And a lot of times we won't notice this stuff until we go back and just study out the Hebrew. So I would always encourage a lexical companion to us when we study. But in verse 9, then she said to her husband, I know that the one who often passes by here is a holy man, so let's make a small, walled-in upper room and put a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp for him. The word lamp is menorah, so that would take our eyes back to what? What visual structure should we be thinking of then? A temple or tabernacle, right? And of course, that's in an enclosed room. And across from the menorah, what do you have? This structure that's holding bread, what is that? It's a table. And then when you're standing between them with menorah on the left and table on the right, looking at where the actual Ark of the Covenant would be on the other side of the curtain, though, this says here that he will have a small chair, but the word in Hebrew actually is throne. And with that, what is the Ark of the Covenant? It's not just the mercy seat, it's also God's portable what? Throne. So here we have three instruments that bring our mind and attention right back to an enclosed space where sacred space is, where the new consecrated Adam figure, the high priest, gets to walk around at to represent the people of Israel. So it's almost like we've got a small little temple as an upper room built on the upper level of this woman's house. Who's the person meant to go in there and stay? Elisha. Why does that matter? Consider the story we just read, that this man of God freed this woman from the tyranny and oppression that was about to be imposed upon her and her family. Think about Jesus and what he says when he's reading from the Isaiah scroll in Luke 4. The Spirit has come upon me, and he has anointed me to preach the good news of release to the captives. The year of Jubilee, basically, is what he's saying. So all that to say that Elisha, and kind of thumbing on the Jesus vibe already, is something of a deliverer, almost like a new Moses, but then with the Shunammite woman's son. So let me abbreviate the story here. He decides to bless her by saying, what can I do for you? Can I speak to the king, the commander of the army? And then she doesn't want anything in return, but Gehazi, his servant, recognizes she doesn't have a son. So Elisha says, in our English translations, it often speaks to the idea of this time next year. But really in the Hebrew it says, at the time of life, which means next year when springtime comes in and things start to grow and bud, you will have a child. As the story goes on, though, it's going to take some time, several years to pass, but eventually that child winds up just dying for unknown reasons one day out in the field with his father. Child is brought back to the house. The woman finds Elisha and Gehazi, and then she falls at his feet and says, why did this have to happen? I didn't want this torture of having to deal with a deceased child, and this happened because you chose to bless me like this. Anyway, so Gehazi runs ahead of Elisha, bringing his staff, puts it next to the boy like the prophet said, but nothing happens. Elisha gets there, and in a very similar way to what Elijah did, he spreads himself out over the child and whatnot, and then eventually the child is revived. Breath comes back into him. There's this weird mention of him sneezing 7 times, but anyway, he sits up and he's totally fine and restored to his mother. But let's backtrack here. The woman has a husband who has not been able to provide a child. He's old and could die at any time. So if she dies childless, that puts her in the realm of need for what? A kinsman redeemer. Somebody in the family would have to take it upon themselves to marry her, because we could presume this man has no other children then, and this would raise up a child in the stead of the dead husband who was not able to provide a child. So what does Elisha do? When he steps in and he supernaturally provides the child by the blessing of the Lord, the child is the end result, and he, in a sense, is noticed to be the conduit of that. So could we then reason that Elisha is acting like a kinsman redeemer? I would say yes. And not only once, but the child dies. And what does he do to rectify that wrong? He brings the child back, acting as a near kinsman redeemer twofold in this story, which is huge because we consider the idea of what a kinsman redeemer has to do. They have to exit outside of their bubble and enter into the life and misery of another person, because the only reason that circumstance is created is usually because of death and tragedy. And with that, of course, that's thumbing along the thread of Jesus as our kinsman redeemer, God who incarnates himself as human flesh. And with that, enters into our den of vice and misery to choose to redeem us out of that scenario. And then, like the woman who experienced next year at the time of life, a time of life comes with for us. All that to simply say, one thing that we should start to clue ourselves in on here is the idea that Elisha is a life giver. And that's hugely important with respect to the Messiah arc. So a lot more to interplay with that in the rest of this chapter and the next one. But